All right, good evening. This lecture, Unit 3, Lecture 6, is going to be about the first phase of the Civil Rights Movement. So they'll cover from 1955 to about 1963. All right. Application, and let's go. When we last looked in any great detail at the situation for African Americans in the United States, segregation had become law of the land thanks to Plessy versus Ferguson. And since then, attempts have been made to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, as well as Cummings versus School Board, which had allowed schools to be segregated by race. Groups such as the NAACP had been attempting to use the legal system in a way to overturn the separate but equal provisions of American race relations. There had also been other smaller groups, the NAACP being the largest, but groups, A. Philip Randolph's group during World War II, which had helped get New Deal programs and work in manufacturing for the war effort to get more jobs opened up to African Americans, and then other groups like the Congress of Racial Equality, which had also been doing more what we would call direct action to try to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. So there is some groundwork that has been laid. The civil rights movement that is birthed in 1955 does not just come from nowhere. Efforts have been going on for over half a century by African Americans and by their allies to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson and Cummings v. School Board. As far as overturning, well, let me start here. The main focus for what we're going to look at today for the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1963, the main focus is to overturn segregation in schools and public services. Okay. And I've already mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson and Cummings versus School Board of Education are the two cases that have allowed segregation into the United States. And so what we're going to look at today are the court cases and the direct action that's going to lead to overturning these two levels of segregation. So let's start with the school district, because that is the one that comes first. And so when it comes to overturning school districts, we are looking at the Brown decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This case is heard before the Supreme Court. Here is Brown, the actual Brown in question. This is a case coming from Kansas. So this is not a segregated school in the Confederate South. This is in the Midwest Kansas, where the plaintiff, Brown, was not allowed to attend the all-white school that was only a few blocks from her house, but instead had to travel a much further distance, 2 or 3 miles, to a segregated school. And so this case had been working its way up through the court system and eventually arrived at the Supreme Court in 1954. Now, the lawyer for the plaintiff, that is the lawyer for Brown, was Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court. And Marshall's arguments were based on the work of a psychologist named Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark would be what we would today call a child psychologist, although that was not really a position in the 1950s, but most of his work was done with children. He used particularly play and art. He had, if you've ever been in a child psychologist's office, there's a lot of toys, there's a lot of things that are at children's height. And so Clark was using what we would recognize now as the tools of a child psychologist. Clark's work demonstrated that segregation created a permanent sense of inferiority on African American children. Left them with low self-esteem problems that would linger into adulthood. And the way he did this was with dolls. He would have what he called the doll test, in which children, and I'm getting a picture right now while I'm explaining this, were allowed to play with what were essentially, baby dolls. I'm getting the picture right now. Just a second. And the child would be told they could have one of the dolls. They'd keep the doll. And these dolls are pretty much the same doll except for the color. And the children would, and these are young African American children, would inevitably choose the white doll. And when asked why, they would say the white doll was prettier, the white doll was nicer, the white doll was not as ugly, things like that. And so based on that, again, segregation left a permanent sense of inferiority on children, low self-esteem. And he repeated this experiment with numerous children, African American children from across the economic spectrum, poor to more middle class, urban, rural, big city, small town, and he found the same effect over and over and over again in his clients about which doll was prettier or nicer, et cetera, et cetera. He would ask, which one is the nice doll? Which doll do you want to play with? Which doll is the prettier doll? Those type of things. And inevitably kept coming back that children were choosing the white doll. So based on these arguments being made before the Supreme Court in 1954, segregation of American schools. Basically, the court said that no attempt had ever been made by Southern schools to make schools equal in any way. Now, the failure of the court is that it did not place a timetable for desegregation. It simply said all deliberate speed, and whatever that means. And so you'll see some school districts and school boards that will really drag their feet on desegregation. There will be schools 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education that still have not desegregated. And again, this isn't just about African American schools and white schools. This is also about segregated schools for Asian American, Hispanic Americans, who are all also going to segregated schools. And so this is a tremendous shockwave sent throughout the country. Many schools simply, again, did nothing. Some did, and we're going to come back and look at in more focus at a desegregation attempt several years later in Arkansas and see how that went. But for now, I want to turn to Montgomery. And of course, that had its opponents. Okay? Remember what I said about anything you don't like, you could just try to pass it off as something being promoted by communism. All right, that's the specter of Joseph McCarthy's legacy hanging over American politics. Apparently, race mixing is also about the march of the Antichrist. Is that what this says back here? That's what I'm guessing it says. In addition to this, there were several other high-profile events leading up to Montgomery. 1955, August, the brutal murder Emmett Till. Let me make sure I'm spelling that correctly. M-N-E-T-T. Yep. Emmett Till was from Chicago. He was visiting relatives down in Mississippi, and allegedly, and there the The quote-unquote victim has given different stories, but he allegedly touched a white woman, and he was lynched for that. He was picked up by the woman's husband and one of his friends, and they tortured Emmett Till, and then they murdered him. His mother insisted upon an open casket funeral. Pictures were carried in Jet magazine as well as several other magazines. And as it turned out, the quote-unquote victim, years later, before her death, admitted that Emmett Till had not touched her. He had talked to her. He had probably been flirting with her. But he had not touched her in any way. And those interviews were not released until about 10 years ago. The two men who were responsible for Emmett Till's death were tried and found, they were acquitted. One of them died a few years later. Yeah, it was Carolyn Bryant, if you want to look this up. But yeah, towards the end of her life, she admitted that Emmett Till had not done anything wrong, and that it was only her husband's threats to beat her that had caused her to basically get up on the stand and lie. Let's see, what happened to those two guys? One of them died from spinal cancer. I forget how the other one died. Bryant and Malam. Let's see here. What film? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Brian was around, he divorced, died of spinal cancer, yeah. Oh, and the other one died of cancer too. All right, well, God took care of, well, all right. After that came the events in Montgomery. Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. And this is where Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus to a white gentleman and is arrested. And this led to the founding of the Montgomery Improvement Association, headed up by Martin Luther King and several others, E.D. Nixon. And they really had very simple demands. They wanted black drivers, African-American drivers for African-American routes. And what was called a fixed color line. The way the color line worked, if you were on a bus and there were no white people on board, you could sit anywhere you wanted. But if white people got on board, then you slowly had to, the color line moved back further and further and further into the bus. And that's kind of what happened to Rosa Parks. And so they wanted a fixed color line that meant white people had to stand Well, that meant white people had to stand, that no African Americans would have to give up their seats any further. A one-day boycott became a one-year boycott. Now, the bus line was ready to fold really quickly. You have to remember that most of the people who rode the bus in Montgomery, Alabama were African Americans. Okay? So the bus line was hurting for money pretty quickly, but it was the city who forced the bus line to carry on. Eventually, the Supreme Court struck down segregated buses. Now, white reaction to all of this took three forms. At the local level, what were called white citizens councils, and they would have boycotts of their own. So if you were a white person and maybe you had an African-American maid or a gardener, you might be pressured to fire them. Okay? Right? If they're going to hit our pocketbooks, we're going to hit their pocketbooks. Second, at the state level, the concept of nullification is revived. You should have gotten nullification in 1301, but basically the idea that the state can refuse to follow federal law is what nullification is. And then finally, what's called at the national level, what's called the Southern Manifesto, signed by 100 Southern congressmen. Desegregation, signed by 100 Southern congressmen urging resistance to desegregation. And as always, the Klan comes back, the third Klan. The Ku Klux Klan had pretty much, to an extent, faded during the New Deal years. It isn't to say that African Americans weren't being lynched during the New Deal, it's just the Klan was not as powerful as it was. But like herpes, the Klan made a comeback, this becoming the third iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. So we've seen a bit of lines being set down. Okay, African American leadership has learned the value of a boycott. They've learned the value of media coverage, which we're going to look at here in a second with Arkansas, and white reaction as well. So, what the heck happened in Arkansas? Well, we're going from flashpoint to flashpoint is what's happening here. So in 1957, the next flashpoint is in Little Rock, Arkansas. Arkansas was seen as a moderate state on questions of race. For instance, medical schools in Arkansas had already been integrated in the late 40s. Law schools in Arkansas had been integrated in the late 40s. And the governor was really not particularly concerned. When the Supreme Court made its decision, he said Arkansas would comply, as quickly as it could. So the plan, as much as anyone came up with, was to desegregate 1 grade per year starting in 1957. Okay. And the Supreme Court had said all deliberate speed. Now what's going to happen here in this first thing is it's going to be 2 or 3 grades because so few people are going to volunteer. The location that's going to be chosen is Central, wow, I really typed that one out badly, Central High School in Little Rock. I feel like I have some more pictures here. Let me see if I can find them real quick. Okay, I had more pictures here. This is Central High, and it really hasn't changed that much over the years. Okay. Eventually, 9 students volunteered to be part of the desegregation efforts. Initially, about 80 students had volunteered, but some of them, their parents had put the pressure on them, not to desegregate, not to take part in this. Others who were student athletes had been told, if you go to an all-white school, you're probably just going to sit on the bench for your entire season. So eventually it's whittled down to these 9 students. And everyone was expecting a smooth, calm transition. If you look at the newspapers in the days leading up to this, there's no sign of there are 10 people in this photo. This is the student advisor here. Okay. There's nothing in the newspapers to indicate there's going to be any problem. There's nothing to indicate that there should be any controversies at all. But there were some underlying tensions in Little Rock that nobody picked up on. Okay. Let me move to a new slide. Okay. Probably the one that no one really missed, or the biggest one that people missed, was class tension. Central High School was working class high school, okay? Kids whose parents worked with their hands, blue collar, okay? Working class. The kids whose parents were doctors and lawyers and stuff like that, their school wasn't the one being integrated. It was the blue collar people, the kids whose parents were construction workers and worked on the manufacturing line and dug ditches for a living and were seamstresses and cleaned hotel rooms. Those were the kids whose school was being integrated, not the rich kids, okay, who went to the nicer school that would remain lily white. Right? No one picked up on that. The other thing nobody picked up on is that Governor Faubus was being pressured by other governors to hold the line against desegregation. Now, Governor Faubus didn't really have a career to return to. If he were to not be reelected as governor, he didn't really have anything to fall back on other than going back to being postmaster somewhere out in the Ozarks. So he definitely wanted to keep getting elected governor as much as possible. On September 3rd, 1957, Governor Faubus called out the National Guard to keep the peace in Little Rock. Now, there were no disturbances. I don't know what kind of peace he's needing to preserve because everything was peaceful. But once the National Guard was out, this kind of encouraged people to come out and look around and wondering why the National Guard was here. And that led to some mobs beginning to form. And basically the National Guard was told by Governor Faubus not to let the students enter the school. So September 4th, National Guard the African American students from entering the school. Now, except for one student who had shown up on her own and was hounded by an extremely angry mob. This is Elizabeth Eckford, and she managed to get away because a newspaper reporter hustled her onto a city bus. Now, as you can see here, this is all very visual. Later that afternoon in Arkansas, these people show up. And this is all being captured in print. It's being captured by TV cameras. It's being broadcast on the news. So this is not something that's happening in isolation. And it's being rebroadcast by the Soviet Union into the communist parts of the world, telling the communists, look how the Americans treat their poorest and most vulnerable citizens. They turn the army out to keep minority children from getting an education. And so this is wonderful propaganda for the communists. It's being rebroadcast throughout the Soviet Union, throughout Eastern Europe. There are pictures of it being run on newspapers in China. Hey, look how capitalism treats its poorest and most marginalized people. It pulls out the army to prevent them from getting an education. Look how wonderful capitalism is. The president, Eisenhower, told Faubus to get control of the situation. Faubus promised he would integrate the school. He promised the President of the United States he would integrate the school, then broke his promises. So you've promised the President of the United States you're going to do something, then you broke your promise. And he's not only the President of the United States, he's a 4-star general, okay? Eisenhower is used to, I give you an order, you obey the order. And that's how he viewed his relationship with a lot of governors, okay? This mightily pissed off President Eisenhower. Okay? And this is not a man you want to get on the bad side of. Eisenhower took control of the National Guard and sent the 101st Airborne to integrate the school. So here are the mobs being driven off. Oh, look how sad this one guy is. He can't be a racist shitbag anymore. And here we see the troops entering the school with the 101st Airborne. And these are students who are being escorted to school. They were in a large station wagon. Okay? In front of them was a Jeep with a machine gun. Behind them was another Jeep with a machine gun. And the 101st Airborne stuck around for a few weeks before eventually withdrawing. The 9 children were subjected to very harsh treatment. One of them quit, but the other 8 did stay for the entire year, despite all the many problems. Everybody got something from Little Rock, okay? Civil rights leaders learned how to use media. This is a very visual story. You don't need a lot of words to explain exactly what is happening here, okay? The media got a great story, one that, again, does not require a whole lot of background in order to help you understand it. And Orville Faubus got reelected multiple times. In fact, Orville Faubus taught an entire generation of Southern politicians how to play the race card in order to stay in office. Okay, how to manipulate anger about issues of race in order to stay in office. He would not be the last politician to use these tools. Now, what does the effect this have on desegregation? Well, from 1954 to 1957, that is from Brown versus Board of Education to Little Rock, 712 school districts had desegregated before Little Rock. After Little Rock, only 49 school districts desegregated. So again, an entire generation of congressmen, of politicians, learned how to delay on desegregation. And again, there would be parts in the South and here in Texas well into the early 1970s that were still not desegregated. And they figured out how to stonewall those efforts. The other thing that came out of this, in places where they couldn't stop desegregation, like there were parts of Virginia where the school districts just closed the schools. They just stopped, they just shut down the schools. Nobody went to school. And then the parents would put together these private academies, which became, you know, where the white kids could go and not have to mix with other people. The next flashpoint, February of 1960, what is called the sit-in movement begins in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 students went to a lunch counter and simply sat there, not being served. The next day, more students showed up, and by the 3rd day, every seat in the place was filled with African American students who couldn't be served, and that forced that lunch counter to desegregate. This became a very popular tool amongst civil rights activists, this idea of simply sitting in and, all right, you're not going to serve me, well, I'm not going to get up either. And so this became a very popular tool of the civil rights movement. And it was a tool that was adopted by others, becomes one of the more effective tools adopted by the anti-war movement. What we see here at Columbia, 1965, probably. The women's movement used the sit-in movement as well. So a lot of other groups adapting this tool for themselves. The sit-in movement also led to the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The people doing the sit-ins were college students. And so it was felt that they needed to become an organized group of their own, separate from the older Southern Christian leadership, Dr. King's group, the NAACP, the groups that were 10 to 20 years, membership age older. So SNCC largely becomes an organization of college students and high school students. It is also an integrated group with both of all Americans, regardless of their skin color. And we'll see more of SNCC later on. And we'll also see them in when we get to the second part of the civil rights movement. In 1961, several groups will come together, some of them from SNCC, some of them younger members of SCL will come together for the Freedom Ride. What happened here, and CORE as well is responsible. This is James Farmer, who helps to organize this. The background here is that the Supreme Court had ordered that bus stations had to be desegregated. A lot of Americans still rode buses to get around the country, and so the Supreme Court ordered. You may remember all the way back in Unit 1. Let me go back and find it real quick. I've shown you a picture where it had that waiting room. This picture from 1952, all right, this is a bus station, Carolina Coach Company. So again, if you pulled into a bus station, you were waiting for your bus, you had to, there were separate places to hang out for the African American patrons. Railroads were the same way. Supreme Court had ruled these have to be desegregated. And so a group of people were going to ride on a bus through the Deep South see if the law was being obeyed. Okay? And so they were going to go from Washington, D.C. all the way down to New Orleans. And as you can see, things got bad pretty quickly. All right, a bunch of people jeering at you. Oh, firebombing. Okay, that's a little more intense. And here we are beating some of the riders. The police often would just kind of stand around and wait till this was over and then arrest the people who have been riding the bus. Here are two of the riders. This is John Lewis, former congressman who died in 2020, but he had been on one of these freedom rides. And the people were badly beaten. One guy was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He had been thrown down over stairs, and when he landed, he hit a railing with his back. Was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Eventually, federal troops had to be called out in order to protect the bus, and eventually it was decided to end the bus ride in Jackson, Mississippi. That's as far as they got. But I think on the 50th anniversary, they went back and finished the trip. Some of the people who were still alive, along with some other younger people, went and finished the trip from Jackson to New Orleans. And these mobs, again, can be very vicious. In fact, at one point, somebody from the Justice Department was on the phone talking to the president. This is John F. Kennedy at this point, describing what was happening, and some of the mob came over and pulled him out of the phone booth and began beating him up while he had been on the phone with the president. So again, providing protection, but also getting them to cut the trip short after Jackson. Again, highly visual, newspaper, television, seen around the world. Okay, again, the communists are broadcasting all this stuff into their sections of the world. 1962, the first African-American student, James Meredith, is admitted to the University of Mississippi after a night of riot and vandalism, which saw at least one person killed. He is admitted into Ole Miss. The next flashpoint came at Birmingham. Birmingham, Alabama, or Bombingham, as it was known, was a stronghold of Klan and Klan sympathizer activity. Dr. King himself decided he would be leading this one personally. This is where he will compose a letter from a Birmingham jail, which, if you haven't read, you really should. His opponent was Sheriff Bull Connors, whose real name was Eugene. I guess I'd have a nickname like Bull too. Bull, who had ties to the Klan. For the first couple of weeks, there really wasn't any conflict. Bull Connor was smart enough to realize that conflict is what the media was looking for, and that if there was no conflict, then the media would get bored and possibly go away. So for a couple of weeks, there really wasn't a whole lot, but eventually Alabama, Birmingham turned full force against protesters, hitting students with fire hoses. And if you have never been hit with a fire hose, it is not a pleasant experience. A fire hose will strip bark off of a tree. So you can imagine what it will do to a human. Eventually, President Kennedy went on television and gave a speech. This is about May of 1963. Full support for a civil rights bill. The speech Kennedy gave on television, a speech that was somewhat improvised, in which Kennedy gave this famous quote. Again, using language from 1963, Kennedy saying, "Who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in the Negro's place?" Now, Kennedy had a reputation of being slippery, of making promises and not keeping them. And so it was decided by all the civil rights groups that they were going to hold Kennedy to his word. And this led to the March on Washington. On August 28th, a Wednesday, August 28th, 1963. Again, all of your civil rights groups are there. SNCC is there, the SLC is there, the NAACP CORE is there. All the major groups are there. This is where Martin Luther King gives the "I Have a Dream" speech. Okay. To give you a clue of the direction for the second phase of the civil rights movement, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, this jobs part, King and some of the others were beginning to realize that there were serious economic problems among African Americans that needed to be addressed. And that is what a lot of the second phase of the civil rights movement is going to be about, economic opportunity, something we'll get to when we get to Unit 4. This is the peak of a unified civil rights movement. After this, some splintering will begin to take place, particularly the younger civil rights groups like SNCC will begin to peel away from their older counterparts. And in fact, on this day, I believe John Lewis, I could be wrong, but his speech, he had been told by some of the older civil rights leaders to tone down his speech. And so there's definitely some behind the scenes tension that's already beginning to splinter the movement, and will splinter it even further. And so within less than a year, even though there will be a Civil Rights Act, in 1964, that splintering will be fully on display by the summer of 1964. And so that's a story we'll get to when we get to Unit 4. All righty, and that concludes the civil rights movement, first phase of it anyway, from 1955 to 1963. So I will see you in our next video.